Where do you think your path to retirement will lead? That's what we hope to help you find out in the short course. We want you to be able to close your eyes and see the positive world you can create for yourself as you transition away from full-time work. Once you have a vivid picture in mind, it will be much easier for you to make your dreams a reality. We will help guide you through a 5-step process to create your own unique vision board. We will provide instructions for using Pinterest and show examples on this platform. Of course, if you prefer, you can build the same board with magazines, scissors, and tape in your own home. When you've completed the project, you will have a unique, personal set of goals that you can then share with your advisor. We think you will be surprised how much easier retirement planning will prove once you have completed this exercise.
Why is visualization so important? Top athletes frequently rely on visualization to improve their performance. Blue Angel pilots will meet and visualize flight plans before every single air show. But will visualization help you better achieve results in planning and saving for retirement? Studies and surveys suggest the answer is yes. A large number of academic surveys suggest that creating a strong, positive vision of your future self in retirement will make you more likely to save for that time. A survey in 2016 by TD Bank found that people who kept images, photos, or vision boards of their goals are almost twice as likely to be confident they'll meet those goals compared to people who don't. By following the process laid out in the next few videos, we hope to make you much more confident about your future as you transition from full-time work into retirement.
Someone once said, if you can imagine it and visualize it, you can create it. We use Pinterest in this course to create that clear vision. On Pinterest, you can create public boards that the entire world can see, or you can set them to be private so that only you see what your future holds. If you haven't already, create a free account on Pinterest.com after this video. Note that your use of Pinterest is at your sole risk and subject to applicable terms and conditions. Alternatively, you may prefer to build a physical board. In that case, get poster board, scissors, glue, and find a lot of magazines. Think of Pinterest as a virtual bulletin board. You can copy links to pictures, websites, or upload images, and then pin them to your account. You can organize your pins on boards. The boards in turn can have sections inside of them. Watch how this happens.
Once you've set up your account, you can begin creating boards that help you envision your retirement. Start by creating a board by clicking the plus button on the right side of the screen. From the drop-down menu, click Create Board. Enter a name for your board. We chose to make a board called My Home.
Some suggestions for pins will pop up. You can save these images to your board by hovering over the image and selecting Save. Or you can search for new pins in the search bar at the top of the page. This is where you can embrace your creativity and design the board to meet your personal vision and goals.
You can also create sections within a board by selecting the board and clicking the plus sign, then select Section under the Add tab. For example, you could add a section called Kitchen Renovations and add pins within this section.
Now add pins within this section by following the same process as described previously. You can save suggested pins to this section, or you can search for more specific pins regarding kitchen renovations. When saving these pins, make sure you select the correct board, as well as the section within that board.
Now you've successfully created your first retirement vision board and have begun the process of bringing your retirement to life.
The purpose of a retirement vision board is to bring your retirement to life today. Creating an inspired view of your retirement means you have a constant reminder of your long-term goals. This helps ensure your financial and personal choices today support your future savings and income needs tomorrow. A retirement vision board is not a set it and forget it thing. You should make it a habit to change and build as time goes on. Creating a vivid retirement vision will be an exciting activity. This is your chance to tell your story. Who do you want to share your journey with? Where and how do you want to live? How do you want to devote your time? What do you hope to accomplish? And when do you want your journey to begin? The exercise will prove intentional and fill you with hope for the future. When you're feeling inspired and enthusiastic and know what to do next, there is no limit to what you can create. Ready to start? Watch the next video.
Someone once said, "You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." With whom do you want to spend the most time in retirement, and how will this define you? People should spend more time thinking about the answer to the question for a variety of planning reasons. If you want to continue to spend time with a close group of friends, understand what they plan to do over the next few years. You may quickly learn that the people have different goals and objectives in the next 5 to 10 years than you do. Some may want to golf every day. Others may want to have coffee each day in town. You may need to make some tough lifestyle choices to remain engaged with them during retirement. Similarly, you may want to spend time with your family, your children, or your grandchildren. How you spend time will depend on many factors in their lives. Your children may change careers. Your grandchildren will likely go to school and start a life in different parts of the country. In addition, you need to consider the activities that will draw these individuals together. Some may like activities on the water. Others may prefer spending time near mountains. Others may enjoy restaurants and entertainment only available in large cities. Who will those 5 people be that you hope to spend most of your retirement with? Put pictures of them on your board or people who look like them. They could be your spouse, your family, maybe a best friend. Think about the activities, places, and ideas that engage them the most. They should also be ones that you enjoy as well. Because these people will influence who you become in retirement, it's important to consider them in your vision. Give it a try.
Where and how you live will dramatically shape your life in retirement. Based on your current financial condition, you have a very good idea about the range of options available. You may be fortunate enough to have several homes in different parts of the country, or perhaps a single residence works best for you. In either case, you should consider the same set of factors as you plan ahead. Let's start with the physical home. First, think about access and imagine yourself 20 years older. Do you need a garage or can your car be outside? If you and your spouse remain active and in good health, walking over wet or snowy steps may not be a concern. However, think long and hard about steep stairs to bedrooms and how that may impact how long you can remain in your existing home. Do you want to live close to others your age? Prior to the pandemic, senior communities were a great option for support. Now you need to think about the trade-offs involved and the cost and long-term health risks. Living in an apartment building eliminates many worries, but today may create new ones. Do you want to live in a warm climate and avoid the work associated with winter? Do you want to enjoy all 4 seasons? You also need to think about the obvious financial concerns. Certain locations cost less to live. Taxes are lower. Cost of living is lower. However, these cities and states may be located far from your friends and family. As you age, you may find it harder to get the support you need from your social network. If you do plan to move to a new part of the country, try it out. Spend a week living in this new location. We want you to create a picture of your home, where you physically live, where you walk, and where you drive. Will you stay in the town where you live, or will you move to the mountains or the coast? What size house do you need? Does it have a lot of stairs? Is it easy to maintain? Can you walk to town for coffee? Or can you stroll to the edge of a lake and take a boat out for a ride? Make a vivid picture on your board.
How will you spend an average day in retirement? First, you should understand that your level of daily physical activity will greatly influence the quality of life in later years. A study in the Aging Research Review found that higher levels of physical activities increase the odds of healthy aging by 39%. If you need more than numbers, look no further than many of today's motivational speakers. Someone once said, "When you wake up, you can't just wait to see what kind of day you'll have. You have to decide what kind of day you'll have. Let's start to make that decision today for your future life. Consider exercise. Many people find walking, running, biking, or swimming in the morning the best way to start the day. Some find groups motivating, or others prefer to exercise on their own. Think about engagement in the community. In later years, you potentially have time to make a serious difference for the issues or causes that matter most to you. Most communities offer ample opportunities to help with causes like food banks, blood drives, or elections. Reflect on the hobbies you enjoy today. Perhaps one of your favorite activities can open a door to new possibilities. Create a board that reflects your new life in one day. Start in the morning and finish with how you end your evening. We can't wait to see the day you create.
Planning for retirement offers many people a chance to dream again. Someone once wrote, "Every morning you have two choices: continue to sleep with your dreams or wake up and chase them." Let's start to chase yours today. What's on your list? Maybe you think of this as a bucket list. Perhaps you view this as an opportunity to create a second life. Here's a quick list of ideas to get you started. Climb a mountain in a distant part of the world. Visit every national park in the United States in an RV. Feed 1,000 families in need at a local food bank. Write a daily blog for a year on a topic that means something to you. Take your grandchildren to a Major League Baseball game. What would you like to accomplish without the worry of a regular job? Begin building that picture today.
With a picture of your retirement like this, do you want to start your journey early or start late? Timing impacts your retirement plans in many ways. You need to decide if you will stop working at once or transition into retirement over the course of many years. Timing may affect whether or not you will need to personally fund more of your healthcare costs sooner than planned. Also, consider when you want to begin taking Social Security. The longer you wait, the larger your monthly payments will be. Some retirees may find that easing into retirement by working part-time allows them to supplement their income enough to wait before collecting Social Security benefits. Your health, your profession, and your personal desires can all help you determine your desired retirement date. You need to get a clear financial picture of your current assets and liabilities in order to have an informed discussion with your financial professional. You can leverage Nassau's free retirement planning worksheet to create a complete balance sheet for you and your partner. You can save it as a PDF and share it with your financial advisor or insurance producer.